I'm Karen Potter, Sustainability Ambassador for ideaXme, and I'm speaking with Chris Palmberger, Executive Director of the Carpathian European Wilderness Reserve. The reserve is in the heart of the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, and it's a unique conservation project supported by an international group of private philanthropists. We are facing a stark humanitarian and environment crisis as a result of our overconsumption and reckless use of fossil fuels. We have altered the global climate trajectory, and before COVID-19 began to spread, a wake-up call was sounded by scientists and academics and kids from around the world, and it was ringing loudly across the globe. There were growing numbers of people at the beginning to grasp the severity of the crisis that we're facing and demand action. As we try to slow the pace of environmental change, preserve natural habitats, and support the global population boom, we will increasingly rely on nature-based solutions. Trees and forests are a significant part of the solution to climate change. Unfortunately, the destruction of trees on a mass scale continues impacting the benefits derived from natural habitats. As human activity increasingly relied on trees for fuel, protection, and a growing number of products, forest biological diversity was severely impacted. Nearly 50% of the world's trees have been felled. Forests cover about a third of the world's land area, but they're disappearing at an alarming rate. According to the World Bank, between 1990 and 2016, the world lost 1.3 million square kilometers of forest. Trees are significant for many reasons. One of the most important contributions is the ability to absorb carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas resulting from human activity. Tropical tree cover can provide an estimated quarter of the emissions mitigation needed to cover over the next decade to meet the UN climate targets. Change must come from every sector of society, and we need government to set a regulatory path with with committed long-term vision. We need businesses to lead through product and service innovation, and we need consumers to change their behavior and adapt to new, more sustainable lifestyles. Coronavirus restrictions have given us a chance to reflect on what some of these changes will look and feel like. Less flying, less driving, and using less products and services. We're keen to hear about how Carpathia is working to protect the natural environment and promote a healthier future. So now I turn over. We need a shift in approach to habitats and ecosystems. Christoph, can you talk about how Carpathia started and what made this initiative successful?
Yes, of course. I guess, Carpathia simply started out of necessity. We had in the mid-2000s, so 2004, 2005, forests were restituted to people that had lost them during communist times when they have been nationalized, or actually not to those people, but usually to the heirs of these people. These people had not much connection to these forests. For them, it was like getting a bank account. So they very often handed them over to logging companies that would just come and put money on the table to these people. And then, ruthlessly went into the mountains, did massive clear felling, destroyed a lot of the natural, beautiful Carpathian forests. So it was simply, we had to do that. We had to do something. We were just seeing that happening in front of our eyes. So we needed to get started to do something there. And I think this is now about 12, 13 years ago. And I think the success that we had was because we were looking at the whole thing from a very holistic approach. We were not just doing the one thing, we really tried to analyze the whole situation, the whole issue, including and mainly the people. So, it's often in conservation that you look just at the habitats, but in an area where there is a lot of people, we have to look at the people in the first place. And so I think this has been a lot of the success that we did. And of course, because we have a very dedicated and excellent team of people, we started just Barbara, my wife, and myself, all by ourselves. We have now grown Foundation Conservation Carpathia into the largest conservation organization in Romania. We have almost 100 staff now, and this has been, development over 10 years, and I think it's just that people really believe in what we're doing.
So how did you start to generate the support? Sounds like it was a local initiative, so members of the community began to take interest, but I noticed that you had an international group of conservationists and philanthropists supporting your project. So how did you develop that support and grow it into the international community?
Mm-hmm. Well, the whole thing started really, there's a small national park nearby, about 15,000 hectare national park. It's called Pietra Craiului. And I was here in their office, and I met the national park director during this time when you know this massive logging started, and they even lost forests on a daily basis inside the national park because the government had been I can only say either so stupid or so ruthless that they restituted land even inside the existing national parks, which is basically asking for troubles and intentionally trying to destroy the national parks. So he told me about the situation. He told me that they are losing their forests. They can't do anything because the whole system was so corrupt. They were trying to take people to court that logged illegally in the national park, and they lost every single case because of bribery. And so I asked him, what do you think could be done? What's the solution? And he sort of was thinking of making a joke, and he said, we'd need somebody who is very wealthy to buy up all these forests just to keep them under protection because they're for sale anyway. So whether it's a logging company or a wealthy person with a conservation background, it would be the same for the people, but it would make a very big difference for our national park. And we were both laughing about that funny joke and that strange idea. And very shortly thereafter, I got a visit from a woman from Switzerland that we knew from before. She had been supporting our previous project. We were working in large carnivore research and conservation, Barbara and I. And she came to look at what has happened with us. And so we were out there, we showed her what happened. And she said, well, buying up a whole national park basically is something that is too big for me, but I could ask my brother, because my brother is actually I think the wealthiest or the second wealthiest person in Switzerland, which we didn't know. So that was, an incredible opportunity suddenly. So, a few months later, she came down with her brother and they looked at it. And since he had only 24 hours available for us, we hired a helicopter and flew with the helicopter around this national park. It's a big mountain block. Flew around there to show him, what's happening and how wild this area is. And actually, he pointed into the direction towards the west, and I didn't really know much. I knew that there is a mountain range called the Fagarash Mountains. And so we just kept on flying, and we flew with the helicopter for a whole hour over this area, which was like just forests and peaks and very, very wild areas, no settlements, no people, no roads, no nothing. And so when we came back, Hans-Jörg told me, see, I'm willing to help you, but I think we should not look only at this small national park because there's so many around and this is not really significant. You get next to this small national park, you get a much larger area that looks, from the air like an incredible opportunity to create something that he by then called a European Yellowstone. And so this was, where we said, wow, this is an unbelievable vision and an unbelievable opportunity. And of course, he said, I'm gonna help you to kickstart it. I help you with buying forests and land in this national park. But then later on, you have to find other people that help as well. I never do things all on my own. And this is how it all started. And then, once you have such an incredible story, we had a network of organizations and we were talking left and right. And, they then introduced us to other people and these other people introduced us further on. And that's how we eventually, managed to create such a network. And it's not just a few billionaires that are putting money in. We are having now, in total, probably around 30 different organizations that donate to our project. And That can be anything from 20,000 euro all the way to a couple million euro. But it's also a strength because we have so much support now from a wide range of organizations and people.
It's an incredible story, which really, I think, highlights the power of that kind of developing a network and a community. And the global conservation community has really been stepping up because nobody else is. And I think there's so many threats to so many global habitats that, learning from your experience, I think many other organizations can take things away from that. Did you, once you were able to get the land into some safe hands, were the loggers and others satisfied to go somewhere else, or how did you develop a relationship with that community to ensure that you were able to work positively with the local community?
I mean, you have to understand that this timber mafia that exists is not really giving a lot of benefits to the local communities. It's not the local communities that are the bad guys and that are logging down everything. I mean, of course, you have in every community, you have a few that take advantage of the situation, but these are usually, regional logging companies that are, just going in very ruthlessly and take advantage of that situation and fell big areas, use the corrupt system that was by then. It's now much better. Things are not that easy anymore for these guys. And of course, when we came in and we competed against them and we started to buy forests, and then not just only buy forests, but then also employed rangers that went out, and when there was, an illegal logging happening on the other side of the valley from where we had bought something, then we went and we sued them, and we went to the forest guard, and if they didn't react, because they were obviously during that time very closely involved in this whole illegal logging stuff, we went to the ministry, we made it public, and so sort of forced them to get active. And once they came in and they had to do the control, and we were there, and we made sure that the control was real control, and they had to fine them. We broke the chain, because the mafia, said, well, why do we bribe you if you afterwards stop us and fine us? And so we managed at least, to move them out of our area. But of course, it's still far away from having stopped them in total. But over these 12 years that we're active now, and 10 years since we have the foundation, a lot has happened, and especially in our area, the illegal logging has maybe not gone down to zero, but it is really sort of on an acceptable level now.
Well, it is inspiring to hear how successful you've been able to be in this. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the habitat, the biodiversity itself, because as I was reading a bit about your organization, I was understanding that you had some of the most outstanding biodiversity in that part of Europe, in the mountains. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that biodiversity might have shifted from when things were sort of 2 decades ago and where you are today, with the effort, almost a decade ago, to preserve the space and to begin to help develop that very important ecosystem and biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, first of all, you have to imagine that these Foundation Mountains, like many other parts of the Carpathians, but the Foundation Mountains are probably the wildest place in the Carpathians. That is an area of about 200,000 hectares. So it's huge, it's really big for European conditions. I think it's about a quarter of Yellowstone National Park. And, we're still in the middle of Europe. So having such big areas where there's not a single settlement in there, there's only one summer road going through the mountains. So this summer road is open usually from July all the way through to October until the first snow comes again. So it is a very, still pristine area, but that doesn't mean it's only wilderness. We do have significant amounts of virgin forests, still forests that have never been cut before. But otherwise, let's say for the last 100 years or so, there has been forestry in one way or the other in the area. So a lot of the forests that we deal with now are secondary forests, and there has been sheep grazing up in the alpine grasslands for, depending on the area, up to some of them up to several hundred years. So people have been a part of this ecosystem, but nevertheless, we have the largest surfaces of virgin forests in these Foundation Mountains, still in probably the highest density in all of Europe. We have significant numbers of wolves, of bears, of lynx. We have chamois in the high alpine. We got red deer, wild boar, roe deer in the forests. So basically, the ecosystem is very, very intact still. There's just a few species that are missing, and a few areas that have been altered. Where there was maybe a mixed forest, and they have once they cut it the first time, they've planted spruce forest. But overall, the area is still very, very high in biodiversity. There's a lot of species that are everywhere else in Europe on the red list, and there's even a lot of endemic species that you find only in the Foundation Mountains. So it is, not just for Romania, jewel. It is really something that is for all of Europe, something of major importance.
And in terms of managing such a big area and ensuring, obviously the ecosystem in the virgin forest that you were mentioning, it will sort of manage itself and nature will take its course. But in the areas where you're trying to help bolster certain habitats and change the way people have, kind of replenish what has already been taken away, how do you manage? What is the requirements for like day-to-day management, and how do you ensure that? I know you're keeping an eye on some of the logging and trying to ensure that illegal logging, I'm sure there's poaching or illegal hunting and other things that happen. What is required of the wilderness reserve in order to maintain things and to help support the ecosystem there?
I mean, we basically work on several pylons, and when we talk about the habitats and the ecosystem, I should mention 3 pylons. The first one is our land conservation. So that means we buy as much as we can, whatever comes up on the market, whatever somebody wants to sell, we're trying to buy it in this Foundation Mountains. We started on a more restricted area, but we're now on a much larger area, and whatever comes up for sale, we're gonna buy it. The second thing is that we do have these clear cuts that have happened in the last 15 years. So we have to deal with them. Unfortunately, those ones that have done them, they haven't done anything. So when they're smaller, they do grow back into some sort of a forest because there are seed sources coming in from the left and from the right. But if we're talking about larger clear cuts, and we have some that are 300, 400, 500 hectares large, it will take ages until the forests come back there again. So what's happening is that grasses are starting to grow there. So you have in summertime, you have grasses that are maybe almost a meter high. And so every little regeneration of a tree, is being choked in there. It just cannot grow. So we have bought a lot of these clear cuts and we replant them. But that means, not just replant them, but we also need to go in and cut the grass around these little saplings once or twice a year, simply until they are, tall enough that they can survive on their own. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of very intensive work. That is also something that gives a lot of jobs to the local communities, which is good, and which gets people positive about what we're doing. And then, of course, we need to produce the saplings ourselves. So we have big tree nurseries, because it's also we're not just replanting anything. We are trying to replant what we consider was the original ecosystem, plus foresee already the changes due to climate change. Because if it gets 2 degrees warmer, then the whole ecosystem will shift 200 meters up. So what we would have now, 1,500 meters, we might have in 70 or 80 years when these trees are a little bit older, might have, you know, 1,700 meters. So so this is why it's you know, quite important to spend a lot of time on these clear cuts. And then, I mean, the third thing next to the restoration is also the whole wildlife issue. So we have purchased, or not purchased, but we have leased a lot of the hunting concessions, and we are now controlling about 65,000 hectares of hunting concession, where we, again, you know, we protect wildlife. We have reintroduced the bison, the European bison, into that because that was the only species that is missing. But at the same time, we do a very intensive control of damages around the villages.
And is the majority of the staff, you said you had about 100 working with you now, are they working on that aspect of the regeneration pieces, or do you have a lot of other roles that people support in the effort to manage and maintain the reserve?
Well, the pure restoration is usually done by people that are not even employed with us, and we work on, you know, separately extra. So because we have, like, you cannot plant throughout the whole year. So you plant trees like from end of March until early May for a 6-week period. So during this 6 weeks, you know, we get an additional 150 people from the local communities, and then we just pay them as daily labor. So many of them are, you know, disadvantaged people, very poor people, often Roma communities that, you know, don't really have any other sources of income. So for them, it's very, very good that they have these 6 weeks of very intensive work where they can make good money. And then they have again during the summertime, you know, when they do the cutting of the grass around the saplings. And then in autumn, they are again, you know, needed for the autumn plantations. And so plus, you know, the tree nurseries that need permanent supervision because we're not using any chemicals. So everything is done manually there. So this is, you know, everything that comes on top of that. So our people, I mean, we have, you know, the foundation now is so complex. So we have wildlife people, we have you know, botanists, we have even lawyers, we have a legal department. They, you know, they're looking that everything's okay. We're having human resource, we are having an accounting department, we're having project leaders because, you know, we're running on different projects, so we need people to administrate these grants. And then of course, you know, all our rangers, they're probably the most of them, but overall, you know, very, very widespread organization now.
And do you work with other international conservation groups? Do you share ideas and inspirations with other groups, or are you working very much on your own with the support?
No, we consider it very important to work with others. On the one side, because we want to learn from them. You know, we're trying to pick up as many good ideas as possible. And on the other side, of course, you know, we think it's also important that we spread the word of what we are doing. So we are, for example, part of so-called Endangered Landscapes program, which is administered by the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. And, you know, we're RSPB and Flora and Fauna International and some other organizations are part of. And it is funded, this program, by the Arcadia Fund, which is, you know, the charitable trust of Lisbeth Rousing and her husband. And so we're part of that group. There's eight projects working on a trans-European scale. They're all funded through this Endangered Landscapes program, and there we meet every year and we have a lot of exchange and learn from each other, and that is very, very helpful.
And do you use that platform to engage politically at all? Are you trying to promote any kind of environment policy, trying to push any of the in terms of climate change and the environment legislation that is starting to come in effect on a much stronger scale internationally? Are you using any of your influence to, either in Romania or in Europe, to have an influence on that policy?
I mean, you know, we're not an activism organization. We're a pure conservation organization, hands-on, working with the boots on the ground in the area. But of course, you know, beyond that, we are trying to to get impact on the political discussions. So we are part of a coalition of conservation NGOs in Romania, where we do give our opinion, where we talk about what we're doing, where we have had influence on some of the, let's say, more visionary requests that this coalition has. We have been sort of spearheading vision for protected areas, where we have now, I think it's 3 years ago, where we have requested the Romanian government to protect 12% of the Romanian land surface in the form of national parks, and protect 30% of the land surface in one way or the other. And this was, by then, 3 years ago, everybody was laughing at us and saying this is totally unrealistic. Even interestingly, our colleagues from the conservation world said this is totally unrealistic. Now, the EU has just published a biodiversity strategy, which obliges every country to protect 10% of its land mass in perpetuity and full protection, and 30% of the land mass must have one way or another of protection status. So this is exactly what we said 3 years ago. So we're very happy about that, and hope that this is now being implemented. We're also trying to make our experiences and our project heard of on the level of the European Union. We have been awarded a very, very big LIFE grant. LIFE is the funding instrument of the European Union for conservation, and we have been awarded probably, I think, as much as I know, it's the largest LIFE project in the history of the European Union ever. We've been awarded that in December last year. So this is, of course, something where a lot of people on the in the Commission are talking about. So we have had several meetings with several commissioners, and we were actually invited even into the cabinet of President von der Leyen to present our idea there. And I mean, what we actually want is, we want to show with our Carpathian Mountains National Park project, we want to show to Romania what is a blueprint of a national park, how a national park should be developed, and what benefits such a national park could have. Then, once Romania would have adopted such a policy, go on a trans-Carpathian level, that all of the Carpathians could become such a biodiversity and carbon storage area, and then possibly even have impact on the overall European agenda. So this is sort of what we're aiming off. How far we get, I don't know, because life is not all that easy, and we're just a small regional NGO from Romania. But anyway, it's always good to have big visions.
Indeed, and it sounds like many of your visions have been realized. So it's a real example for other conservation organizations to see what when it seems like the scale of something is too great for a small project. I think you've really demonstrated that by using the right, to having a great space that needed support and needed the intervention, finding the other people who get behind you and beginning to build that network. And it sounds, as we're discussing, it's fascinating to hear that you're not an activist organization, and yet the political reach you've had, it sounds like it's been quite profound. So that is very encouraging to know that real world examples are something that can inspire political leadership and inspire change. And this is the kind of thing that we need to see replicated really on a global basis for people, and local people like yourself doing something out of a passion for the land is what it's going to take, I think, on a huge level to achieve the things we need to achieve to stop climate change from taking over, and the global temperature rise is becoming something that becomes unbearable for us all. And I wondered, we talked a little bit about COVID in the beginning. What do you think are the biggest challenges for Carpathia, and how has COVID-19 impacted your work?
I mean, our biggest challenge is, of course, the timber mafia. Despite the fact that we have managed to get them more or less out of our area, our initial area, I mean, in the wider Carpathian Mountains and in Romania, they are still very, very strong. I've heard that the timber mafia is the most important mafia in Romania when it comes to the economic impact. That they turn over 2 billion euro per year from illegal activities. So that is huge. And of course, this timber mafia is not just giving up from one day to another because there's a small conservation NGO coming that is, peanuts compared to what they are. So that continues to be our biggest threat, and especially because this timber mafia is working very much with fake news. So they go into the local villages, they influence the people, they influence the mayors, they tell them, be just very careful, these guys will just, they just represent a group of international billionaires. They want to kick you out, they want to get, hold of your land, they want to control everything here. So, if you talk to them, if you cooperate with them, in no time you will lose everything. And this makes it very, very difficult because, on the one side, there is 27 communities around the Făgăraș Mountains. They're all outside the mountains, the villages, but, they have, of course, interests inside the mountains. And we have had initially the situation that the situation had been very badly poisoned by this timber mafia in those areas where we were not present, in those areas where we bought land, where we restored land, where we hired local people. It was very different because people saw what we were doing and they did not believe these fake news. But in the other areas where we went in at a later stage, it was partially very, very difficult. There was a lot of opposition against us because people already had a preset mind against us, and that takes a while to break that up and to prove what we're really doing and to show what our good intentions are. And so that's basically, I think, our biggest challenge is. But asking how COVID-19 has impacted our work, I think it's in two directions. The one thing is that people generally start to think, what is really important? Is it really important that you buy a big car? Is it really important that you, just make quick and dirty money? Or isn't really the important thing that you're healthy? If you're thinking that you're healthy, you need good food. You need healthy food. If you need healthy food, you need to have an functioning farmers community. And these functioning farmer communities, they're not the ones that are driving the big cars and so on, because that's simply not possible. But there is more reflection back on the land and on a healthy and natural land. So people understand that nature is important and that we need to keep nature or treat nature in a better way. And one thing that has helped us actually a lot is when Romania had the lockdown, the elders, like people 65 years and older, were not even allowed to leave their homes anymore. And people in the villages were not allowed to travel to another villages. That was how the situation was here in Romania for 2 months. And when that all happened, I called up some of the mayors and I asked, how are things going in your village? And they actually said, well, we're hanging on and we don't have any cases, so all is good. But they said what's getting really, really tough is for the elders. Those ones that don't have families anymore in the village, because it's often that the children left to the cities. So the elders were alone in this village. They had, a pension of maybe whatever, between 50 and 100 euros. So very, very little money. And suddenly the children couldn't come anymore to help them. The neighbors couldn't really help them. They couldn't go out of their houses. So that was a real crisis situation. So what we did is we said, we need to help these people purely from point of view that these are people, they're in need and we need to help them. So there was no other thoughts behind it. So I talked to our president and I said, would you be okay if we allocate 20,000 euro from our core money in buying food for these people, because they couldn't even go in the shops anymore and buy food. So he said, sure, go ahead. And so we talked to all the villages where we are present in one way or the other with, having land. And it turned out that every village had about 50 to 60 people that were in real need. And that was 10 villages. So that meant that we had to deliver weekly 600 food packages. So we felt like, this is with 20,000 euro, we don't get very far. So I started to raise funds, and actually it was amazing, the support that we got them. And within 1 week, I managed to raise over 100,000 euro for that. And then we had the money, and we could say, throughout these 2 months, we can help those people really now. All our rangers, went and worked voluntary on the weekends and in the evenings and so on. And at the same time, we said, if we spend this money, we're not going to go to the big retailers and buy the food there. We go to the local producers, because they're also in troubles. They have been producing jams and pickled stuff and cheese and hams and bread and whatever. And now with that situation, they can't sell their products really anymore. So we managed really to hit two birds with one stone. By buying the food from local producers and then delivering it to the people in need. And that was something then what brought us a lot of sympathy. Not that that was the intention, but it happened like this, and people look at us very, very differently now. So we have 10 communities that know us now for that, and it was also for us to understand that that the people are really the key to it. And if you don't get the people along, and if you don't help the people, then your conservation might not get to where you want it to get.
Well, it's an incredibly inspiring story to hear that, how you were able to just respond to that need and do so in a really measured way, and think about how you can expand your resources. And obviously you are skilled at raising funds, so that was very useful. I wonder, because you've revealed a lot about the kind of character about yourself and what motivates you, we could talk a little bit about sort of who inspired you and some experiences in your own life as you were growing up that led you to where you are today. So maybe there's individuals or experiences that you can reflect on to say, these are the people who've shaped me and had an impact on my life.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that life is always a constant learning process, and we always try to pick up good ideas wherever we see them, and then implement them. Adapt them, implement them in our own world. So where we are now has been road of thousands of little steps, and there were a lot of people that have impacted us. But I think if I would have to mention one person that is really sort of has been our mentor and has opened the eyes for us, then this is Douglas Tompkins. Douglas Tompkins, he was a businessman originally. He founded the North Face, this big outdoor clothing company. He was himself an outdoors person. He was an extreme climber. He was a World Cup skier. He's been doing world-class kayaking, and then he, in the 60s, he founded the North Face in San Francisco. Was very, very successful in very short time, and then he got married to a model who told him, we should go into fashion because this is where we can earn much more money. So he Doug sold the North Face and developed a company called Esprit, that everybody knows today, big international global brand. And within, 15 years or so, Doug managed to develop this Esprit into a global player with, turnover of billions of dollars. And then Doug started to read conservation. He was always close to nature, and he started to realize what they're doing is actually not really good. So, because just producing fashion for 3 months or 5 months period, and then you want people to buy new stuff, and the way you produce is fashion clothes, is not very friendly to conservation. So what he did is he first thought about totally changing his business and trying to get into a sustainable organic business, which was by then, in the 80s, something pretty much unheard of. Plus, his wife didn't want to go this way, so Doug sold his half of the business. He divorced and went with all his money down to Patagonia, because this is where he had always been and where he been traveling a lot and where he'd been mountain climbing and doing stuff. And then read really into something which is called deep ecology. Deep ecology means, you don't just protect a species or something, you go really down to the roots, to the underlying causes, and this is where you try to change things. And once Doug had understood what the situation is, since he was in love with Patagonia, he started to buy land in Patagonia. And Patagonia, has huge properties, individual properties. So I think the first property that he bought was like a couple 100,000 hectares in Pumalin. And then, his idea was to restore these areas and to protect them and to create national parks with them. Of course, Doug was getting in the way of all kind of forestry operations, logging, mining, and so on. So he was badly attacked, severely attacked. But he fought it through. He then, after some years, he married again to Chris Tompkins, and Chris had been the CEO of Patagonia, the other big clothing brand. And so those two together, Doug and Chris Tompkins, they continued to buy land and then transform them into national parks and donate them to the Chilean and the Argentinian state. And that was something that was totally revolutionary. I mean, it had happened before in the United States that philanthropists bought land and then donated that to the state, and they made national parks out of it. But on this magnitude, that hasn't happened before. And by now, I mean, unfortunately, Doug died in 2016, I think, on a kayak accident. But Chris continued, and Doug and Chris together have created 11 national parks and have been responsible for the protection of 13 million, I think, acres of land. So that is a huge amount. And I was lucky enough to meet Doug in the early years of our project, when Doug was also, still in the middle of it. And so we could learn a lot from Doug, and he told us from the beginning, this is what will happen, and this is how you should do it, and make sure that you don't make this mistake, and make sure you don't make that mistake. And he also told us, be prepared. You're gonna get beaten up by the mafia. There'll be a lot of people that will hate you for what you do, and they will tell all kind of stories about you, and especially if you're a foreigner in the country, there'll be a lot of racism against you and so on. And so we have learned a lot from Doug, and I think he is the person that has influenced us the most in our professional development.
Well, Doug is another example of somebody who really had a passion for something and turned his business, and that passion for protecting the environment and the land became more important than the money he was making. And I know I'm familiar with his story. Actually, I hail from California, so we are very proud of his business and the way he ran it with an ethical, really one of the early innovators on, as you say, on sustainability and on trying to use a more organic way approach to business and raising the ethical bar and saying, what, we can't just, it's not always about market forces controlling things. That's not good enough. We need to change our behaviors. We need to lead by example. So that's a fantastic story. Well, I wonder, in all your experience and all the networks you've developed, if there still is somebody who you would like to meet, somebody who inspires you in another way that you find a connection with that you haven't yet had an opportunity to meet.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a lot of interesting people out there. But if I would have to pick one person that I would want to meet and discuss, and that's not necessarily because I admire that person, but because I have a lot of questions to that person, that would be Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. Because I mean she's one of the most powerful persons in the world, and I wonder, she has been Minister of Environment in her earlier life, and when she got into power, she propagates economic growth as the only tool to make people happy. And she's leading Germany economically extremely successful. From an environmental point of view, I think Germany is a total disaster with everything that's happening there. We have had in the last 20 years, the biodiversity has gone down, I think, by more than 50%. So we're in an absolute crisis in Germany, and this is where my home country is from. And I would want to discuss with her, how can she, as a politician, having all this knowledge, just go ahead with this, this idea of a never-ending economic growth, and understanding at the same time all the negative effects that our economic way of living has upon the environment, and how much we destroy, and to understand better. And I mean, I'm sure she has thought a lot about that, and to understand better how this politics on the highest level, how they function, how they work, because that would then help you and help us, to see how can we influence that. Because if it worked in this way, it should also be able at some point in time to work in the other way. But you have to understand the whole system, what is behind it. This is what I would appreciate most if I could pick one person.
Well, certainly we have a lot to learn from how are we going to manage to make that transition. We all know now that we must stop burning fossil fuels. We all know now that we need to approach life in the future in a more sustainable, circular economy, in a way where we're using less. And that challenge seems very difficult for politicians. So we spent a lot of time through mechanisms like the United Nations, under the guidance of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they've been calling for quite some time now, decades, for change. It seems the support is incremental from global governments, but now we're really going to find out whether or not they're up to the task, because we've been warned now that we just have one short decade at this point to get it together, to try to keep global temperatures to a 1.5. Even that is looking like a very, very difficult achievement. So measured responses and very serious policy and financial support to make these changes is what is required, and yet we're not seeing that leadership. Now, many people from other parts of Europe look to Germany as a leader, so it's a little bit concerning to think that Angela Merkel is not one of the people yet who gets the severity of the problem and needs and understands how much we need to rely on the leadership of governments to make this happen. Now, what's interesting is they complain about, we don't have enough money to spend, we can't set these regulations, we need to let the market forces control. And when COVID hit, suddenly there were interventions that they were capable of doing. There was money that was able to be used to help people in this crisis. And many of us would argue that that kind of intervention needs to carry on so that we can address the problems with climate change. I've been fascinated by our discussion today, and I must say, I think the work that you're doing is really so important as a leading by example, just getting things done, even when people tell you they can't be done, and even when it seems insurmountable from a small country and a small piece of the world to be able to achieve the things you've done, I think is incredibly inspiring. I wonder if you have any sort of other comments before we close out our interview today, anything else you'd like to mention or say in closing remarks about your work or about the future of conservation, or just what you see yourself, what you see as the challenges or things that you're interested in seeing done in the coming years?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess there's two things. The one thing is that, there's a lot of talk about climate change. And luckily, there's an increasing amount of talk also about the biodiversity crisis. And I think they're totally interlinked, because ecosystems get even more unstable if we lose a biodiversity. And so the effect of climate change will multiply if we have very fragile ecosystems. And this is something that, politicians and city people and whoever, is not directly living out in the countryside have to understand that even if you're not a biologist and not a conservationist, all our survival depends on biodiversity. So this is the one thing. The other thing is, looking at ourselves as conservationists and people trying to change things, I think it works only if you live it yourself. There's a lot of people that are preaching conservation, but then they're chatting around the world and so on. I think that that in the long term, that will not be successful. And at the same time, whoever is listening, who is a conservationist on the ground, I think you have to become part of an environment that you want to protect. Of course, if we're talking about the Amazon area, you don't need to become part of it. This is an uninhabited, or it's an area that it's not uninhabited, but it's an area that can be simply protected. But if you're talking about Europe, there's nothing like this. So in Europe, everything depends on local people, and you need to take those local people along. And they cannot be convinced from somebody in the city. And I think this is also part of our strength. We are living in the countryside. We're having a farm. We are farmers as well as we are conservationists. We have our problems. We have just 2 weeks ago, a bear came and killed one of our pigs. And so on. We're dealing with these situations on a daily basis, and it gives you much more credibility towards local people when you come with the other side of the story. And I think this should be something for conservationists. Go out, live where you want to protect the area. Don't just live a comfortable life and try to preach to people that are working, their bums off and having a much harder time than you have. Become part of it, and then you can change much more. And this is where the success is.
Well, I think that's very important for people to be the people who are on the ground. I think I was trying to say that a little bit earlier, that you're the one with the experience. You're the one who's actually putting into practice these solutions that need to be done. And oftentimes there's a disconnect between the policymakers, but I'm pleased to hear that you are actually working, despite the fact that you're not a campaign group. You are working closely, and you're using your project and the reserve as a force for providing an example of what can be done, setting a goal in terms of trying to continue to grow what you're working on and to help share sort of your best practices and the information and the network that you've established. So I think it's wonderful work. The timing is incredibly important. And as I said, I know the IPCC thinks we have about a decade to do this. So I think the more and more we can replicate projects like yours and get communities involved, and that's going to keep people from doing those flights. I was listening recently to one of the UK's leading scientists, and he was talking about, his name is Sir David King, and he was saying he can't fly right now, but he's on phone calls to all over the country, all over the world. And this is a nice way for him to engage with people. He doesn't feel compelled to fly to California to speak to the governor and have an hour-long meeting and then have to fly back to London. So I think these kind of changes that are coming on the back of coronavirus and showing people we don't need to do all of that. We don't need to make all those journeys, and we can actually lead by example, and we can actually put ourselves in your shoes and see where you're going to, where you're coming from. And additionally, to allow people like you, as you say, the people who are actually doing the things on the ground, to take more of a leadership role and to talk about the realities of what's the challenges are. So excellent. Fascinating discussion, very wide-ranging. I want to thank you for all your time today. It's been a real pleasure, and we look forward to following your progress and seeing, hopefully we'll see.
Thank you very much.
All right. All the best to you.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much.